Thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land that we're on today is the traditional territory of the original peoples of Turtle Island, and I pay respect to the land and to elders past, present, and future. Thank you, Provost Deakin. This award is profoundly meaningful to me in many ways. I'd also like to thank Jane Garland, Dean in the Faculty of Health Sciences, Kevin Shoemaker, who's the real Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Health Sciences. I'm the past, right? Vicki Smythe, Director in the School of Nursing, and members of the Selection Committee, along with my wonderful family, including my husband Mark Flint, who's here today, and my son and daughter, who both live in New York and couldn't be here, and all those whose friendship and collegiality have nurtured and sustained me through many years. And warm congratulations, Patrick. As some of you know, as Janice just told you, Mark and I recently returned from several months in Spain, in southern Spain. So we were there in our villa by the sea. Is my picture? Yes. When I was organizing some thoughts for today, hence the ocean-inspired metaphor. As I contemplated the idea of a shoal, like any good researcher, I turned to Google and Wikipedia. To my surprise, I found such titles as Navigating the Shoals of Cannabis Banking Regulations and Navigating the Shoals in Hypertension. I didn't spend too much time on this line of research, but my hasty and very superficial meta-analysis revealed that common to all was the idea that a shoal, essentially a sandbar in water or a group of fish swimming together, could be a barrier or hurdle that is difficult to overcome, but one that can indeed be overcome. Though the navigation process is often nonlinear, circuitous, and messy. Because I have spent much of my career thinking about how to do research in ways that are personally, politically, and professionally meaningful and relevant, while still giving me the credibility and respect that I need for success in the academic world, I'm going to talk a little bit about my efforts to navigate the shoals, sometimes more successfully than other times. First, I need to provide some context and need to get personal, because all of this is deeply personal and political. I suppose I've always been an activist of sorts, before I had the language to call myself one, and long before entering into the world of academia. I grew up in a New York Jewish liberal household where talk around the dinner table often focused on some sort of social injustice. I learned about the Holocaust and about the civil rights movement. New Rochelle, where we lived, was the site of the first busing case in the North. Efforts were being made to close a predominantly black grade school and bus the students to other parts of the city, with fierce opposition by many. My parents, both social workers, were quite involved in the integration effort. I remember spending time during recess practicing marching for the civil rights parade that we'd be going to on the weekend. Over the years, those parades turned into anti-war marches in New York, Washington, D.C., and at the University of Wisconsin, where I went as an undergraduate. It was probably one of the more interesting university experiences. I sometimes say that more of my learning happened outside of the classroom. Not surprising, since the university was shut down during much of my time there, and the National Guard had to be brought in to restore peace. These were heady days. We marched against the war and for women's rights. We protested when major corporations, such as Dow Chemical, which manufactured napalm, came to recruit on campus. We went to Woodstock, about which I remember little, and I don't mean Woodstock, Ontario, and we believed the revolution was imminent. I did somehow manage to get an undergraduate degree in anthropology. I studied Quechua and had romantic notions of saving the Indians in South America. I was going to be a voice for the voiceless. For a variety of reasons, and probably a very good thing, that didn't occur, and I didn't save anyone. Instead, I worked in a neighborhood health center as a VISTA volunteer, VISTA being the domestic branch of the Peace Corps. During that time, I became interested in women's health, went back to school for nursing, worked in a variety of settings with women and children. After I received a master's degree in parent-child nursing from the University of Michigan, Mark and I moved to Canada in 1982, thinking we'd like to live here for a year or two. So I actually first came to Western then, had sessional appointments and maternity leaves over the next 8 years, and I began to do some research, but realized that I needed to learn more, so returned to school for my PhD. It was 1991, We had very few nursing PhD programs in Canada at that time, so off I went along the 401 to Wayne State University in Detroit, deciding that our son and daughter were old enough to handle this. They were 4 and 6. It was during that time that I returned to some of the themes that had shaped my early years. In particular, as I listened to my family speak about the Holocaust, I was always struck by the extent to which past traumas continued to shape the lives of people so many years after the traumatic events ended. This became a theme that I've continued to explore in my research, beginning with my doctoral dissertation, which was a critical narrative study with children of war and children of battered women, looking at how these two groups of children who had been witnesses to violence in their homes and on the battlefields made sense of the trauma in their lives, what health means when violence is a part of everyday life, who gets to be healthy and who doesn't, and the notion of resilience. Why do some children come through horrific events seemingly unscathed while others continue to suffer? In the process of doing this research, I faced several formative navigating the Shoals moments. The gatekeepers. I encountered several people, mainly from within the academy, who suggested the research should not be done because I could re-traumatize the children. What happened in the past is done, best to leave it in the past and let them start anew. I was taken aback and questioned myself doing the study. I was a new researcher, I'm a nice person, and I didn't want to re-traumatize anyone. Fortunately, I encountered others, including many leaders from within the refugee communities, who offered support and encouragement and believed strongly in the importance of the research. I also learned that researchers typically prefer to talk with adults about how their children are doing rather than talk with children directly. The adult-centric biases. In fact, much of what we know today continues to be based on adult reports about their children, despite the fact that there's considerable evidence showing that adults are often not fully aware of what their children are experiencing or witnessing. What I've come to understand since that time is that people, young and old, want and need opportunities to talk about difficult life experiences. They need to be given safe spaces in which to do it, with the appropriate resources in place. And we need to ask the question, who is it we are trying to protect through our silencing and marginalizing? Children are capable of telling us a great deal about the dynamics of violence. They can show us something about coping and survival, about hope and despair. But what they tell us depends on what we are prepared to hear. It was also during that time as a doctoral student that I began to learn about critical and feminist scholarship, about the idea of research as praxis, essentially meaning the combination of research, action, and change. I was inspired by the writings of, among others, Paulo Freire, who wrote in Pedagogy of the Oppressed about his work with the peasant farmers in Brazil, developing a literacy program that enables people to critically reflect on their reality, to name that reality, and to consider strategies to change it. Radical ideas using knowledge to bring about change, for which he was subsequently imprisoned and forced to leave the country, later teaching at Harvard and returning to Brazil when the political tides had turned to become Minister of Education. It was exciting to me to think that there could be a place in academia to engage in research that was also grounded in social action and change. After completion of my PhD in 1996 and the start of a probationary tenure-track position, I gave a great deal of thought as to how to make my way in academia. And I received a lot of advice, some of it helpful, some not so helpful, from well-intentioned people. Among the highlights, save the research you really want to do until after you get tenure. Don't do participatory action research. It takes too long. Get tenure and you can change the world later. Don't mention the F word, feminism. Be an objective, detached, and apolitical scholar, not an activist. Qualitative health research won't get funded and isn't really research anyway. Focus on the teaching and research, do the advocacy on your own time. The clear message was that activism and academia don't mix. And I struggled with what these admonishments meant to me. They seemed so fundamentally flawed and antithetical to everything I considered to be important. Interestingly, one of the very first grants that I received in 1998, along with my colleague Marilyn Ford-Gilbo, came from the Medical Research Council of Canada, the precursor to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, for a study titled The Impact of Women Abuse on Family Health Promotion Processes Among Single Mothers and Their Children, a feminist grounded theory study. And I remember a discussion before we submitted the grant about whether we should use the word feminist. We did, and much to our surprise, we got the funding. And it was empowering to realize that there could be a place in the academic world for this type of work. Since those days, I've continued to develop a program of research related primarily to violence in the lives of women and children and its impacts on health. For 5 years, from 2005 to 2010, it was my tremendous privilege to hold the position of Scotiabank Research Chair with the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, with the amazing team of Barb McCrory, Peter Jaffe, Maria Callahan, Joy Lang, and Lena Rodriguez. A wonderful space where participatory approaches were valued and where feminism was not viewed as a liability but a shared value. My own work paid particular attention to girls and young women, focusing on some of the subtle and more insidious forms of violence, including sexual harassment, long before Me Too, an important movement, but one that I suggest has overlooked the fact that sexual harassment begins long before girls become women, and schools are a primary site where this occurs. Over time, the work moved beyond an explicit focus on gender to a broader analysis that takes into account its intersections with race and class. We mentored girls and young women in the research process that worked alongside us as co-researchers. In the process, we paid attention to issues of power. What does it mean to work as partners amid inherent power differentials? Another study during that time, funded by CIHR, embodied trauma, the influence of past trauma on women during the transition to motherhood, looking at how past trauma experienced by Aboriginal women, refugee women, and survivors of childhood sexual abuse affected them as they became new mothers. Study conducted with my dear friend and colleague Robin Mason and Jody Hall, Robin is here from Toronto today, and others. And we learned how thoroughly invisible experiences of past violence and trauma are to healthcare providers. I also recognize that if we're serious about addressing the issue of violence, we need to be engaging boys and young men. So expanded my work with the CIHR team grant that Janice mentioned earlier, focusing on the notion of structural violence and using arts-based approaches within a youth-centered participatory action research methodology, learning about experiences of exclusion and marginalization among different populations of youth across Canada and impacts on their health. Interspersed throughout this work are a number of common threads and navigable shoals. My work is fundamentally about health, what it means to be healthy when violence and trauma are part of everyday realities, where structural inequities are deeply entrenched. Increasingly, I've paid attention to the impact of social and economic disparities on health, the fact that these are increasing, with detrimental impacts for individuals, families, and communities. Over the past 2 decades, there's been growing recognition that biomedical and behavioral indicators are insufficient markers of health status, that more importantly, we need to consider the social and economic conditions that impact health, the social determinants of health, and move away from frameworks that situate health problems solely within the individual and often result in blaming people for poor choices. But doing this type of work, attending to the social and structural inequities, is rife with shoals that need navigating. It's not quick, linear, and it can't be done by university researchers alone. The requirements for engaging in this work aren't always conducive to or congruent with the do what you need to get tenure messages that I received many years ago. I think that's the wrong advice and would prefer that we look at our systems, including promotion and tenure and annual performance review mechanisms, and contemplate what type of changes are needed that support and encourage engagement with community partners, taking into account the time needed to develop trusting and authentic partnerships. I could not have done the work I've done over the last 20 years without the development of deep partnerships and friendships that extend well beyond the academy. While there is a growing mandate from the funding bodies for the inclusion of knowledge users on our grants, I'm concerned that too often this means scrambling several days before the grant is due, trying to obtain letters of support from our community partners, and in fact may inadvertently contribute to a new source of exploitation. The establishment of partnerships in name only that lack authenticity. Ultimately, if our research is going to be meaningful and resonate with the communities most directly affected, we need to shift the paradigm and work alongside our community partners, conducting our research with, not on. The creation of the Center for Research on Health Equity and Social Inclusion, where I serve as the academic director alongside community director Steve Goodine, is an effort to do just that and reflects my interest in creating a space where academic and community members can come together around a shared set of values and principles to generate knowledge together, to decide what to do with that knowledge, to support the agendas of both the academy and the broader community. Where diverse voices matter, where with a wonderful group of people with a passion to address the wicked questions, we can navigate some of the many shoals we encounter, however messy that process may be. Since my early anthropology days, I've come to see my work and my interests differently. I reject the idea of being a voice for the voiceless. The situation now and in the past is that the marginalized or vulnerable communities in Canada and elsewhere are not voiceless. They're simply not heard, or if they are heard, they are too often overlooked. My work is in part about creating spaces where those voices can be heard, listened to, and acted upon, whether they are the voices of newcomers to Canada, Indigenous groups, homeless and street-involved youth, the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, two-spirit, and queer community, or those growing up amid violence in their homes or elsewhere. While the Distinguished University Professor Award is a wonderful acknowledgement of my achievements, which I'm thrilled to receive, there is no way this work would have been successful without my genealogy and my communities. My communities of family, friends, colleagues, students, the incredible young people from and with whom I continue to learn so much, the mentors and leaders within the academic environment and in the community more broadly, who have given me the spaces I need to engage in work that I love. Work that is participatory, engaged, and deeply activist. To speak up and speak out against inequality and for justice. That, to me, is the distinguishedness I wish to celebrate, and hope we celebrate more often. A commitment to carrying out our passions in such a way that elevates all of us. In short, that allows us to navigate the treacherous and beautiful shoals between academia and activism. Thank you.